Hi, I'm Susie Garden, and this is the Ageless and Awesome Podcast. I'm an age-defying naturopath and clinical nutritionist, and I'm here to bust myths around women's health and aging so that you can be ageless and awesome in your 40s, 50s, and beyond. The Ageless and Awesome Podcast is dedicated to helping women through perimenopause and menopause with great health, a positive mindset, and outrageous confidence. Hit subscribe or follow now, and let's get started. This week, I have a really special guest. It's journalist Jenny Valentish. She has been dancing around the void for decades, first in bars, then in the boxing ring as a Muay Thai amateur fighter, which sounds very, very cool. Her fourth book, Everything Harder Than Everything Else, cements her as a key voice in immersive nonfiction. Her interviewees push their bodies to extremes, and through delving into their heightened experiences, there's a lot that us mere mortals can learn about the human condition. It makes a compelling companion piece to her previous book, Woman of Substances, about addiction, and I'm super excited about this conversation today. Welcome, Jenny. I'm really pleased to have you on the podcast today.
Thanks so much, Susie. Yeah, as soon as I heard about your podcast, I thought, oh, I've got to hear this. This is so relevant.
Yeah, thank you. So let's start with telling us a little bit about yourself and your journey, because it sounds like it's quite juicy.
Yeah, well, I'm a journalist, but I consider myself to be an immersion journalist, which is sometimes called unkindly stunt journalism or gonzo even. So it's that kind of journalism where you really get involved in whatever you're writing about. So, for instance, for the last book, Everything Harder Than Everyone Else, as you say, I was profiling people who push their bodies to extremes in different ways. So I decided to train as a Muay Thai fighter and write about that just as part of the process. And that book itself came off the back of the previous book, Women of Substances, which was about women and addiction, using some of my own story. And I was thinking about how that in itself is pushing your body to extremes. And in my case, I always had this kind of bloody-minded side to my drug taking, where I was kind of curious as to how much I could push myself and what my body could withstand. And of course, it wasn't, the most healthy way of exploring that. And I've now switched to sports, which in themselves can be not the greatest thing for our bodies, particularly our hormones. So over this kind of period of extremely heavy drinking and drug use, and then throwing myself full tilt into sport, I have really noticed the effect that it's had on my hormones. I'm now 48, and I would consider myself, I guess, I don't have perimenopausal symptoms anymore, but I'm not menopausal either. So I'm in that age range of perimenopause, but not experiencing the symptoms now.
Yeah, but you have experienced symptoms in the past?
I sure have. Yeah, I sure have.
Yeah. Do you mind sharing a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it began for me when I was 34. It began very abruptly.
Wow.
Two things happened at that age. One is I gave up drugs and alcohol. But the other is I came off the birth control pill, which I'd been on for 15 years.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to kind of figure out which had this kind of disastrous effects on the hormones, probably both.
Yeah.
Because the more I researched alcohol and hormones, the more shocked I was at what we don't know about it.
Yes.
I mean, if I could sort of rewind a bit before we get to my symptoms and just look at what substance use does to our menstrual cycle.
Yeah.
It's so long to find research papers that actually covered this, and for me to be able to then translate that for the laywoman. There's just so little information out there, as you know, medical research generally, men are the low-hanging fruit.
Yes.
the very fact that we've got menstrual cycles makes it so much harder for, for researchers to use us as subjects in anything.
Absolutely. Yes.
Which,
it's a big
but
problem.
it also, yeah, but yeah, of course, the flip side of that is, well, then we definitely need to know how our menstrual cycle affects results, no matter what you're testing.
Yes.
It's just harder for them, isn't it? So what I found is, if you think about the fact that our menstrual cycle causes fluctuations in our renal, cardiovascular, hematological, and immune systems, it does make sense that the way we process substances would also affect our cycle and vice versa.
Yes.
So this is what I found.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And you're right. Like, a lot of women just absolutely don't know this. It's not something that's talked about. And yeah, the research is really lacking in women because of the fact we have cycles, and it kind of makes it very difficult for data kind of to be consistent. Whereas, men don't have cycles, so they're super easy to study. So yeah, I find that really interesting. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay, so if we look at the menstrual phase first, week 1. So during our period, the fatigue and low resilience are likely to hasten the effects of drugs and alcohol. So we probably know that. We've probably noticed that ourselves. Like, if it's the beginning of your period and you drink, it kind of can hit you like a bit of a truck, can't it? So that one wasn't a massive surprise. We've got low levels of estrogen and testosterone, so things like hangovers also hurt more.
Yeah.
And then from there, we go into the follicular phase. And this is that run up to ovulation. So estrogen levels are rising. And when we have higher estrogen levels, often we maybe want more chocolate or sugar and that kind of thing. It also makes us prone to more risk taking.
Yeah.
And it tends to make us want to do things like smoke more or drink more. And we're more responsive also to drugs and alcohol as well. So there have been studies that show that we're more responsive to stimulants around the follicular. Am I pronouncing that right? Follicular.
Yes, you are.
Yes, I say it. Okay.
Yes.
Around this phase. Also, estrogen is thought to sensitize the brain to THC, which is that psychoactive component of cannabis. And we're just generally more impulsive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then we go into the ovulatory phase, and this is where the fun police progesterone arrives. So there's evidence that estrogen and progesterone act as the yin and yang when it comes to our interaction with drugs. So whereas estrogen made it more attractive to take drugs and alcohol, progesterone kind of tempers the urges. So when rats were given supplemental estrogen, they would go for cocaine if it was offered quite quickly. But then if they were given supplemental progesterone, their interest waned. And then from there, we go into the week 4, the luteal phase. And here you've got estrogen and testosterone plunging. And so this is where you've got that kind of stereotype of us face planting chocolate.
Yes.
But equally rewarding are alcohol, cigarettes, and drugs. And also, if we're PMSing, we crave carbohydrates. So alcohol provides that as well.
Yes, absolutely.
So, with your expertise, there may be things there that sound right or don't sound right, but this is just the very few studies I could scrape together. This was the information that I could find about the phases of our cycle.
No, and I find that really interesting. And what I'm loving and I'm seeing in a lot of younger women these days is they are really tempering their and being aware of their behavior around different elements of their cycle. And so I think it's really useful to know that how it can impact our ability to, I guess, what's the word? Not be so tempted into certain substances, particularly alcohol. And I'm finding a lot of women that I'm seeing in clinic, a lot of women that are coming into my programs, for some, one of the key reasons is actually because they want to reduce their alcohol intake. And they're finding it really hard to do that, particularly habits that have been formed during this sort of COVID period are really difficult to let go of. And also, I think the increasing anxiety people are having just generally with life, cost of living, alcohol is a very easy, accessible way to kind of numb off some of that. But I don't think many women are aware of how their cycle can impact that kind of behavior towards alcohol, drugs, etc. So I find that really interesting, and I know that the listeners will as well. You've written a book about addiction, Woman of Substances. So I'm really curious about this because of the fact that alcohol seems to be quite pervasive at the moment in women. What did you find happened to your hormones when you yourself gave up drugs and alcohol?
Well, I found one study where blood and urine estrogen levels increased up to 32% in women who were drinking just 2 drinks a day. So by that logic, if you remove alcohol from your diet, if you like, abruptly, you're completely kind of upsetting the apple cart.
Yeah.
So it was a real shock. When I first quit drinking, I used to go to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, and all the women there in women's meetings would be comparing notes. Like if they call it busting, if they ever bust and gave in and had a drink, it would be almost invariably when they had PMT.
Yeah.
And I found personally that I was having symptoms that I'd never experienced before that were really quite full on. So I was diagnosed as having progesterone deficiency.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, in a way, you've got too much estrogen in your system. And it was everything from like gut spasms to nausea to bloating to fatigue to really bad kind of hay fever, histamine symptoms.
Yeah.
I was getting 2 periods a month. So
oh wow.
The second one was like spotting, but spotting extreme.
Yeah.
So, and I would also get kind of PMT in the run up to it. So essentially it was like 2 periods a month.
Oh gosh. Nightmare.
Yeah. I had melasma. The kind of
that's the pigmentation on the face.
Yeah. That was towards the end of me being on the pill, so that might have been down to that, but it just stuck around for a bit. Around periods of ovulation, I would get hives on my face, under my eyes, really bad allergic reactions. It felt like I was allergic to myself.
Yeah.
It was just like, what the hell's going on here? I was just lost in wormholes of Googling, the usual things I think people Google, like adrenal fatigue. And, I went to naturopaths and they were talking about vitamin D deficiency and this and that. And I just didn't know where to look. It just seemed like all my systems were kind of collapsing.
Yeah.
And it feels like this was around 2009, 2010, 2011. It feels like a lifetime ago now, I'm happy to report, because it's just not the case anymore. But at the time it was, joining all these closed Facebook groups about estrogen dominance and progesterone deficiency, just trying to figure out what the hell's going on. And even female GPs just weren't really into helping. Certainly when I'd say, look, I can tell you, I found studies that show that there is a connection between having too much estrogen and histamine kind of intolerance. And look, you can see my face, you can see my eyes are all swollen up and scaly around, the skin was scaly. I'm not imagining this. Clearly something's going on here. But they just know those connections. And, you find yourself bringing in studies to show them. And then you feel like, oh God, I'm that person.
Yes. Yes. And in fairness, sort of a decade ago, there was so much we didn't know about even how the gut microbiome impacts hormones, which certainly would have been, in terms of drug and alcohol intake, it really can damage that gut microbiome and other microbiomes that we have. And that knowledge wasn't there. So there's so much that we know now, and there's a little bit more focus, I feel, now too, going on in the research towards women's health, like even things like endometriosis and PCOS. There's things we're learning now about those conditions that we didn't know 10 years ago. So there's great advances going on now. So I'm hopeful, and I still think there probably are many GPs, not to bash GPs because that's not who I am, but that aren't necessarily across all of that research if it's not their special area of interest. And so, 10 years ago, that the knowledge probably wasn't there as well. And yes, and as you're experiencing these symptoms and you're doing your own reading and research, you probably are finding more relevant information about that than the GP themselves actually knew at that time.
Well, I think a lot of GPs, I mean, I saw a video about this, like a news video, maybe ABC did it, I forget, recently, and it was asking doctors at a conference how much time when they were being trained was spent on menopause, and many doctors were saying none. So, and perimenopause essentially didn't even exist until fairly recently.
Exactly. It's so true, isn't it? Yeah. The term has just not been used. And even like so many of the women that I'm seeing have no idea about that perimenopause starts 10 years before menopause. And these little symptoms that they're having that you can put down to stress or you can put down to other things are in fact perimenopause. But you don't feel like if you're 35 or if you're in your early 40s, you're not feeling like, you think menopause like 50, right? But symptoms are going to happen up to 10 years prior. So and that hasn't, I don't think women are really aware of that. It's certainly not what I hear from women in clinic.
What I think is really great is publishers, as in book publishers, are really quite interested in these topics at the moment. So in the past few years, there's been a spate of Australian books by women on kind of invisible chronic illness. And, I think we can include things like, what was it called? Is it PSMD? No.
PMDD?
That's the one. Yeah. I mean, I kind of privately diagnosed myself as having that, but as I'm sure a lot of people have. But, things like that, they're just absolutely devastating. And
absolutely.
So hard people try so hard to help themselves and figure out what's going on.
And can I just add, PMDD, it's like a very severe PMS. Is what we're talking about here. And and now I'm seeing women getting prescribed like antidepressants and things for it. Which, there are other things that we can do that I think are probably going to give a better long-term outcome rather than just taking antidepressants. But of course, sometimes you just need to survive. And sometimes that is going to be the better short-term option while working on the more underlying cause of what's going on in the body and mind when it comes to something like that. But do you feel like in the research and your reading and maybe your own experience, when there is significant alcohol intake, that also will worsen things like PMS, PMDD?
Yes. I mean, I think anything that puts stress on your system would. I mean, for instance, I think the reason that my system kind of went tits up, if you like, was because there were two things that threw my whole body into imbalance, which I mentioned. One was coming off birth control and one was coming off alcohol, if you like. So by the same token, if you're imbibing an awful lot, again, you're upsetting that natural order of things. But I remember talking to women at AA, and we were all, not all, but those of us that were affected were doing things like our doctors were putting us on and off different birth control pills as if that would help. My doctor was sending me for a pelvic ultrasound. One of my mates at AA, she was sent for a CAT scan because she was getting quite psychotic. And so there are all these kind of ways that we were sort of trying to help ourselves, but I can't stress enough how useful it was to be able to compare notes with people. And when you go to AA meetings, there's often a scroll when you walk in with like the 12 steps. And I was thinking there needs to be a scroll about this is what your body's going to be doing. I would find that more useful.
Yeah, that's interesting. So in terms of how you manage, so when you first came off your birth control after that period of time, and when you were first experiencing symptoms of perimenopause / menopause in your sort of early to mid 30s, how did you cope with that? How did you manage that?
So as I said, the doctor was trying to put me on different kinds of birth control pills, including the mini pill. But every single thing I tried just made me bleed for the entire duration. I don't really know why, but that's what happens. And so then I was like ordering progesterone creams from overseas and trying those. What actually worked for me was really getting into sport. Sure, no one wants to hear that, but it took getting into kickboxing and really getting into it, like training 5-6 days a week for an hour or two at a time. It had two benefits. One is obviously it being kickboxing, you're doing a lot of punching and kicking. And what one of the other symptoms of me being perimenopausal was rage.
Yeah.
Like uncontrollable rage. And so kickboxing became a form of anger management.
Yeah.
So that was, but also it's a very cardio heavy sport. And that over time seems to completely reset my hormones. And I would say, I don't know, maybe about 6 months into it, I haven't really had any problems since. And so that was about 5 years ago now.
Wow.
So I'm obviously inching closer to menopause. I don't know, my mum was 55, I'm 48, but maybe you'd expect symptoms to get worse, but they've actually vastly improved to the point that I don't have them anymore.
Yeah, that's amazing. So you said that was 6 months. So just to get that timeline, so you had those symptoms from about the age of 34, is that right?
Yeah, and I started training in sport when I was 43. So I tolerated it for those years.
That's a long time. That's a long time to be, trying different hormonal options.
Yeah. I mean, ahead of talking to you, I tried to remind myself of what it was like. And I found this Word document I made called My Health. And it was just pages of everything I was trying and elimination diets. And I was like, oh, God, I forgot that was my life.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting when you get to the other side, you can kind of just forget all of the stuff that happened on the way. But so 43 is when you started, and you said about 6 months later, that's when you really felt like that had cleared things for you.
It's hard to remember exactly, but I think it was pretty fast. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's, I will say, for many women, heavy exercise like that may not be ideal. It's always an individual plan. So when I'm working with clients, often I'm saying to them, particularly because a lot of them have anxiety or high stress, is that doing things that are going to get them into stress response and raise their cortisol, like something like kickboxing, is not necessarily going to be ideal. So certainly the message is not everyone go out there and do kickboxing, although I've done some boxing at PT and I've loved it when I've done it. Like for what you say, that getting out some of that emotion and that anger, if you have it, or just general frustration, can be very, very therapeutic to be kicking that pad or whatever. And I do think also sometimes just doing that type of exercise can be just a lot of fun and can feel really empowering. And so mentally you can feel very, very strong. And I think that is so, so important, particularly that mind aspect of dealing with hormonal imbalances, with perimenopause, and particularly even just overcoming addiction or overcoming a kind of a need for alcohol or other substances, if you have that feeling empowered and strong in the mind, it can sometimes help if you are trying to remove that from your life.
Yeah.
Would you
I mean,
say that's the case?
I think you can do a sport more moderately than I did it and still get the benefits. Because you mentioned cortisol there, and I don't think when I was training in kickboxing, I don't think that became an issue. However, more recently, the past year, I've been training in bodybuilding, okay, and I've just competed, and now that really is taxing on the body, and I was really worried that I was going to plunge myself back into hormonal mayhem because first thing in the morning, especially as you get to the pointy end, like 4 months out of competing, you enter what's called the cutting phase. So you're in calorie deficit diet for 4 months. You start the day with an hour cardio before you've eaten, so fasted cardio, and then later you do an hour weights. And I started off fine, but then I started to really burn out, and I noticed things like, apart from the fact I was getting dizzy, I noticed things like, my weight would be dropping as it was supposed to, and then it would suddenly go up. And my trainer would be like, "Oh, you've overdone it. Your cortisol's risen, and now you're hanging on to water weight." Like I'd done something wrong.
Yeah.
And that kept happening. So that was like, by the necessity of the sport, you have to overtrain. But I really noticed the effects on my body. And a lot of women who compete in bodybuilding lose their periods because you get down to, I got down to 7.9% body fat.
Oh, wow.
Healthy range for women of my age would be between 23 and 33%.
Yes.
And I was thinking, because my periods were getting early, actually. They were coming early, a week early each time, but they didn't stop. And I dodged a bullet, let's say.
Yeah. 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 Definitely.
Think about women who compete in bodybuilding and then they lose their period and they don't get it back for a few years. And I'm 48 and I don't want kids, but imagine if you were younger and you wanted them. It's a disaster, really.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's and particularly when you've had your history as well, where you've had hormonal kind of issues in the past, and then trying something new, particularly at this age. But how, I'm curious, like how old were you when you started the bodybuilding? Was it like kind of the last 6 months, did you say?
So it was the last year, so I was 40,
last year
47.
And how easy did you find it to build that muscle tissue?
Well, I came first.
Amazing. Congratulations. That's awesome.
I actually didn't find it too hard because even though I drink these days and not anywhere, it doesn't look anything like it used to. But so during this sort of 9-month period of building, I would still be having cocktails here and there, and I was thinking, I don't know if by the time it comes to strip off this fat, who knows if I'm going to have enough muscle. But I did, and I also found it really easy to lean out. So I know as we get older, it's supposed to be harder to put on muscle, but I think I'm just one of those people who's a bit lucky in that regard.
Yeah, and totally, there's always going to be variation. I mean, I think that's the general kind of theory, is that as you get every decade, you're kind of losing a certain percentage of muscle tissue, and I think you can maintain what you've had over your life, but it's difficult to build on that. Not saying it can't happen, but it can tend to be more challenging. But again, I think we all can manage our biological age by the things we do in our lifestyle, and it's never too late to make changes to get yourself more healthy and get a more a better biological age, rather than just feeling like things are inevitable.
Weightlifting is one of the best things a woman can do. It's only of course, bodybuilding, the nature of it is then that you have to lose a huge amount of body fat. So that's the unhealthy part. But if you didn't do that bit, it's a really easy sport.
It really is. I mean, it's so good for your bones. It's so good, again, I think, for the mind. I do some resistance training and I love it. And I love that feeling when you do hit that next weight level, that feeling of like, yeah, I just, squatted whatever kilos. It's just like you feel really good. And I find that when you're walking around just afterwards and like your muscles are all full of blood and you just feel like you're massive and strong, and it's really good for the self-esteem, for just how you feel about how your ability to do other things in life, that empowering kind of feeling, which I think is awesome.
The happiest people I see, women I see, I would say would be women who do powerlifting and or strongman.
Yeah.
And strongman in particular, it's got such a community around it. It's really supportive. So you're doing things like you're lifting, heavy rocks and yokes, and people cheering you on, and there are competitions. And it's it's just a really fun sport, but it's about knowing your own strength. And there's no, if you're really professionally competing, you might try and get into a certain weight class, so then you have to manipulate your weight. But generally speaking, you don't have to do that. And it's, I just see these women on Instagram doing those kind of sports, and they're just so confident in themselves, loving the feeling of strength and being supported in that.
Yeah. And for someone who's not ever done anything like that, what are kind of the first steps? Like if you're feeling like, well, where would I even start to do something to build strength in my body and to build that confidence? What would your advice be to someone who just doesn't even know where to start?
I found gyms intimidating for ages, even until fairly recently, because there's so many different kinds of machines. Even now, I'm like, I'm not going like that. I've no idea how it works. So my advice would be to definitely get a personal trainer. You don't have to do it for long. I mean, I know they're expensive, but just to really like acclimatize you with the gym. And, there's nothing like someone supporting you and watching you to actually make you push yourself properly, because a lot of people go to the gym and they're not going anywhere near the kind of weight they could actually work with. And so it doesn't really do anything. I hate to say it. You need to really be putting a lot of effort into a workout to see benefits. And that becomes more fun when you're with a trainer. Plus, a lot of us are kind of, we all love validation, don't we? So to have someone going, good, it's, I think you kind of need that to get you on the road you're going on, no matter what. If you're after thinking about any kind of sport, make a start just doing gym stuff with the trainer.
Yeah, and I agree with that, because I feel like we're built for survival, so we want to feel safe and we want to stay safe. And I know for myself, when I train at the gym just on my own, I don't push myself anywhere near as hard, because I don't know where that limit is, and I don't want to hurt myself and then be out for months. And I found when I was teaching yoga quite regularly, and as a teacher, you often will do physical adjustments on clients. And I remember the first time someone did a physical adjustment on me in a twist, and it pushed me to a level that I never thought I could go to. And I was so amazed and so excited about what I could do with my body. And I never, ever would have done it, because you just kind of have this innate mechanism for safety. And so, working with a trainer that is a good trainer, that can actually help you get to a point where you are pushing yourself, where you are feeling safe at that same time, can really make huge difference to how much you get enjoyment out of doing gym or doing any kind of physical movement, I guess. So, I think that's really good advice, to get that professional help. So we're getting close to our time together. I wanted to check in with you, Jenny, to see if there's any other advice you would give to women, particularly around taking steps to move away from an alcohol intake that perhaps they feel isn't serving them. They're not wanting to do it, but they're finding it kind of difficult. And I'm not talking at the level of being an alcoholic. I'm talking about just maybe drinking every day, but maybe it's just a couple of drinks, or just drinking to a level where they're just not wanting it, but they're finding it difficult to stop.
There's a lot more help aimed at people who are kind of gray area drinkers now. Mm-hmm. Like there are more and more gray area coaches, even. Like there are some great women in Australia who are gray area drinker coaches where they can work with you on like, creating a more manageable program. I used to be on the board of Smart Recovery. This is something different now, but Smart Recovery is for people who aren't necessarily abstinent. You can be. There are free weekly meetings, and you can go whether you want to just moderate your behavior more or whether you want to stop. And it's all based around like mindfulness and, CBT. And so it's great for a lot of us are kind of a little bit literate in those things now. So it's great to help you develop those skills, generally speaking. Because I think, as you mentioned, the pandemic really did torpedo a lot of people's drinking or sobriety.
Yes.
Yes. A lot of us have maybe the idea of, well, the 5 o'clock drink. And during the pandemic, when there was we weren't going to offices, I think that became like the 3 o'clock drink or even earlier. And
when you didn't have to drive anywhere.
Yeah.
As well. They didn't kind of have those limits also. Yeah.
So look, there is help out there. I mean, you only have to Google words like sober curious, and you'll find some kind of community, and you can find lots of great non-alcoholic drinks. Whereas when I quit, I think there was one red wine and one white wine that tastes like grape juice. Whereas now there's like such a gamut of really good stuff. I think you can quite easily find a community to tap into. Yeah.
And community is really important, I think, too, with things like this, particularly if in your household, if you have a partner that's actually quite happy with the level of drinking, and particularly if your partner is a male, often their tolerance for it is much higher. Because they don't have those hormonal kind of impacts. So it can be looking for that community outside the household can, I think, be quite useful.
And I remember just one more thing. I remember when I was writing Women of Substances, and I was talking to female professionals who worked with people in rehabs and whatnot, and they were saying perimenopausal women have so much on their plate because it can coincide with so this hormonal upheaval can coincide with kids leaving home. It can coincide with maybe a marriage breaking down. It can coincide with sometimes being let go from your job. Like all these things might be happening at once because of the age that you're at. But also these women were saying that it can also be this weird transitional time where old traumas kind of resurface. So basically there's a lot going on to deal with.
There really is. And often for some women, it's also the peak of their career. So they've got all of these additional responsibilities at work. And then there's this little program that starts running about perimenopause, menopause, getting older, feeling older, seeing signs of age in the face. And that has all sorts of impacts psychologically on self-esteem, and it's a total storm going on when you're in your 40s, I think.
It feels like a storm, doesn't it? It feels like an internal storm.
For sure.
Jenny, it's been feeling like I was allergic to myself, and like, what the hell do I do with that?
And actually I have women say, it's like their whole body has just taken over, and they don't even recognize themselves anymore, and they feel very out of control with what's going on in their body and their hormones. So I think it's a really important discussion to have, because I don't think, as we mentioned before, it's not something that women know about, they talk about, and have an understanding of actually what's going on. So Jenny, if people want to find you and follow you, whereabouts can they do that?
I mainly just stick to Instagram, actually. So and on there I talk about, like, I'm a writing coach, so I talk about that, and I talk about my journalism and also my sporting journey. So it's Jenny Valentish _public.
Fantastic. And if people want to know more about your books, is that information there as well?
Everything Harder Than Everyone Else is the latest book, and you can buy it in all the normal kind of online stores.
Fantastic.
Google the name.
Awesome. Yep, I'll pop that in the show notes as well. Jenny, it's been fantastic talking to you today. I think there's been a lot that has been quite revealing, and I'm I know the listeners will get a lot out of that, particularly discussion around hormones and around alcohol. So thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you. Love your work.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks so much for joining me today on the Ageless and Awesome podcast. If you liked today's episode, please make sure you click the little plus button if you're on Apple Podcasts or the follow button if you're on Spotify so that you can get each new episode delivered to you every single week. If you like free stuff, and who doesn't, then head over to susiegarden.com and grab my 8 essential age-defying secrets every woman over 40 should know right now. Or if you'd like to continue the discussion, head over to Instagram and DM me at Susie Garden Wellness. I'd love to connect with you.